Go. I am here to talk about the three stages of localization maturity. But to give you some context as to how this all came about, I'm the co-founder of Global App Testing, as Adam has said, and we essentially have a crowd of like 90,000 testers around the world, and we support many of the apps that you use on your phone right now to make sure they're working all around the world. And I never understood this maturity story until something happened several years ago. And several years ago, we were doing a test for a customer in Indonesia, and the company was struggling to grow in Indonesia at the time. And in their application, they had it that every user needed to have compulsory first name, last name, and email address as they signed up. And when we did a test in the country for them with users who are from Indonesia, one of the testers reported back that there is an error here because it was forcing them to have a surname. And for those who know about Indonesia, not everyone has a surname in Indonesia. And so that particular issue that wasn't understood by the team in America meant that they weren't getting the level of growth they wanted in that country. And when we ended up working with the customer to fix that issue, their whole management team started to go, what? We can use testing to help us grow in countries? Are you kidding me? And all of a sudden, we started to help with this whole view of how do we help with what we call a narrative. And that's a narrative for us is how do people think about and talk about your department? And to get better at this, we traveled the world for 2 years and we spoke to all of the heads of engineering, CPOs, CTOs to understand what makes great leadership when it comes to building better quality applications. And over those 2 years, we wrote a book on it. And the book became an Amazon bestseller called Leading Quality. And one of the messages that I think is most important for everybody on this call is this idea about the narrative of your department inside your company. And so what is a narrative? A narrative is a collection of the stories that people talk about in terms of what your team does, how good are they, and whether there's value in what you do. And we often see that there are three types of narratives that exist inside the localization space. The first is when a team has what we call a delivery narrative, which is everyone looks at them as the team that is delivering some form of localization. The second is what we call the investment narrative, which is where people start to look at the work you're doing as being an ROI and a true investment that's going to add even more value to the company. And the third is that it's a strategic team that is really help with which countries should we be growing in and how do we better grow in particular countries and having kind of conversations with management. So let me jump into those super quick just to give you an idea about some of them. So the delivery narrative is what I think is where most people start, right? So they start by being very operationally focused to make sure that we are able to deliver translations and text and LQA to our engineering teams. And this usually involves optimizing the workflow. But really great leaders often go past just being having a delivery narrative of what their team are doing. And when we start to see things getting interesting, we see that they start to have more of an investment or an ROI narrative. And they start to look at the work they're doing from a revenue generating perspective, or at least showing that the work they're doing is having a great effect in the company. And so an example of this, we were working with an e-commerce company the other day, and we found an issue in France, and it was on all Android phones in France, they were having issues with MasterCards. And so instead of just saying, hey, there's an issue in France, what they ended up doing was they started to size it. So they said, well, 74% of Android users, 7% of people in France use Android, about 10% of those use MasterCard. Put in all the numbers in the maths, it turns out that this was like a £700,000 a month issue that was affecting them. And so now, way more people were beginning to listen to them about the work they were doing because they were showing that ROI and they were trying to demonstrate that there is so much value in the work that they were doing. And then the third narrative is one of my favorite because it's more of the strategic narrative. And this is really asking the question of yourself and your teams about how can you start to have a more strategic impact on your business. And usually to do this, you have to think broader than just the department that you're in. and you are often advocating the local users to everyone inside the company. I often talk about this concept called a local persona. When we speak with our marketing teams, they always have these broad personas. They might have 2 or 3 inside your company. But what we have to deal with in our industry is that every user in every location in the world, pretty much on every device and operation system combination, they expect the application to work perfectly for them. And so how do you start to think about that for your users and really advocate that? And when you start to work more strategically, you're often having to influence higher up in the organization. So they sometimes say that you're always relegated to who you sound like. But by having more of those ROI related conversations, you're going to be appealing to people higher up inside the organization. We often see people working more cross-functionally because ultimately to get a lot of these things, a lot of these changes happens, it's more than just the localization or internationalization department that have to deal with it. So the better you are at building relationships across the organization, the easier it is to do. And we start to see that sometimes people look into what's happening with their competitors and they do competitive benchmarks and other things like that to truly understand what's going on for their users. And so I just wanted to quickly talk about this concept of a narrative and have people begin to think about what's the predominant narrative that currently exists inside your team. And as you listen to a lot of the cool things that I know the speakers here are going to be talking about, there's going to be so many cool tips and ways to think about how do you start to move yourself into these investment and these strategic narratives. And so that was what I wanted to share. And hopefully there'll be some questions as we get into the Q&A.